All right, well, welcome everyone. So thank you all for coming for this Dean's Conversation series. I'm thrilled that you're here, and I'm thrilled that we have our panelists as well. Today, we're talking about boosting trust in science. So look forward to hearing from our panelists on this. Let me introduce them. And I am going to do it in order going down the panel here. So David DiGrazia is the Elton Professor of Philosophy, and he specializes in bioethics, animal ethics, and the study of moral status. Next, we have Cynthia Dowd, Professor of Chemistry, and she studies structure-based design of drug-resistant diseases. Next, we have Cheryl Jacobs, former VP, Global Development Operations at Amgen, an alum of the university with a Bachelor's of Arts and a Master of Public Health. And to boot, she's also a parent of a student, a 2-degree earning student. So well entrenched in GW. She's also a member of our National Council of Arts and Sciences. So her executive leadership at Amgen in both big pharma and biotech industries. And then last but not least, Alex Jeremick, professor of biology. He examines molecular structures in mediating basic biological processes. And I'm Paul Wahlbeck, Dean of the Columbian College of Arts and Sciences, and I'm thrilled to welcome you here today. We have a series of questions, so we'll go through the panel discussion, and then we'll leave some time at the end for questions from you all. So save up those questions and be ready to pelt us with your best questions. So first off, can you just, so thinking here principally about our faculty members in the sciences, give us a brief introduction to your basic science research and how it relates to medical developments. So how about if we start with you, Cindy?
Great, thank you, Paul. Is it on? Yeah. So in my lab, I'm a medicinal chemist by training and practice, and what that means is I'm interested in looking at small molecules that have interesting biological effects. Specifically, my lab looks at antibiotic drug development and drug discovery, and I'm working on new drugs against tuberculosis and malaria and some other bacterial pathogens.
Alex?
Like Cynthia, I'm kind of in same field, a biochemist by training. In my lab, we are studying structural mechanisms and structural intermediates leading to a host of so-called amyloid diseases. You probably heard about Alzheimer, diabetes, Parkinson, and the common pathological factor actually is misfolding of native proteins that are produced in our body. And for some and unknown reasons, they start to adopt incorrect conformation. Most of these proteins tend to aggregate, do not stay soluble, acquire cytotoxic forms, and then provide a hostile environment to the cells and tissues. So in case of pancreas, and that's the model system we are investigating, the culprit is hormone amylin that is produced and co-secreted with insulin. And again, for unknown reasons, this small protein peptide tends to contribute to the development of type 2 diabetes. And that's the central theme of our lab. I mean, trying to understand the mechanisms and potential inhibitors that can prevent amylin aggregation toxicity in the pancreas, and with that, cure diabetes.
And I guess before we move on, David, you've had some time at NIH. Why don't you tell us about your work as it relates to NIH and bioethics?
Sure. Most philosophers don't do scientific research. I suppose the experiments we do are usually thought experiments, which don't require much funding. But My work at NIH is entirely in ethics, and often what I needed to do was to be conversant in what the scientists had to say in factual areas that were important to the ethics. So, for example, a lot of my work has to do with ethics in animals, and it's important to know or to make reasonable guesses about which animals are sentient. And so work in ethology and comparative neurology, for example, is important to that sort of ethical work.
Thanks. And Cheryl, you want to give us a brief, I gave a few sentences. You want to expand upon that a bit?
Yeah, so I've worked in the pharmaceutical and biotech industry for 30 plus years. I work in the development side of the house and overseeing clinical operations. So all of the human trials from phase 1 through 4 prior to submission to regulatory agencies around the world. And the team actually looks at every component of conducting a clinical trial, from the protocol and taking that and operationalizing it and securing investigators in different countries, securing the patients who are going to volunteer to take our medicines, setting up all of the data collection systems and ingesting all of the data from the trial and preparing that for regulatory submission.
Thank you. So how is scientific research in your field determined to be accurate or of value? So this can be open to anyone who wants to discuss it. All right, Cindy?
Just to repeat your question,
All
you
right.
said accurate and of value.
And of value. So,
Or-
yeah, there you go.
Let's hope not. Okay. So accuracy, any basic scientist is interested in accuracy of an experimental measurement, and that varies in terms of how we do that across the field. I'll go into a little bit about how our work is judged by others, maybe. And I should say one of my roles is I'm an associate editor of a journal, so I oversee journal review, peer review. So an important aspect of how science is critiqued prior to publication and also prior to funding is that a panel of people you don't know, but who are experts in your field, read your work and judge it for its accuracy, its reproducibility. They're experts also in what you do, so they're sort of judges before that work is deemed credible to be published or funded. And that's sort of an integral part of how science works. It's anonymous, and it is without bias. That's the intent. And so the general public may not know about that, but that's a really important part of how science works.
Yeah, Cheryl?
Just add on this statement about scientific accuracy. I think you're probably aware of the scrutiny of the publishing process and verification of the results. But in the end, it's the scientific community that verifies these findings, and you can publish whatever you want. But if this is not verified later on through similar set of experiments or independent labs, then this idea basically disappears and do not hold the ground in scientific community. I'm not sure whether to go into the specifically about NIH funding, but they have over the last 10 years or so, they introduce certain assurances that scientific accuracy is achieved prior to the funding, and they pay a great attention and details to verification of the results that comes on the panel. Of course, publishing is one way to show accuracy, but also panels now at the NIH pay detail, being serving on these panels, really a lot of emphasis on the scientific accuracy and verification of the results in the end. But maybe we can discuss later on about the specifics if we want to go in these details of verification of the accuracy.
So some similarities in the clinical research side. We also have kind of three components that ensure the science is robust. First is the design and the actual writing of the protocol, which is weighed in by other experts in the field, rigorous statistical analyses, and expert review. But in addition, in the clinical research space, we also have some other kind of oversight and practices in place. One are foundational elements such as good clinical practices, which are intentionally defined kind of ethical and scientific quality factors that get applied. But we also have regulatory agencies like the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, European Medicines. Each country that we operate in have their own regulatory agencies that are also there to look at the trial protocol and ensuring that we're scientifically and ethically sound in the research that we're conducting. And then the institutions themselves also have institutional review boards or ethics committees that also look at and oversee the conduct of the study and the treatment of the patients who are volunteering to be on our medicine. So there's several kind of layers that are built into the process around the clinical trial pieces.
So I think my next question, you all have started touching on it, and my next question was, so when you're reviewing the work of others, what are you looking for? So you've mentioned panels, but what else are you, so what goes into your review when you're looking at the work and assessing the work of others in the review process?
I guess scientific rigor and reproducibility is one of these factors that, again, committee pay a great detail of that, either by verification of some quantitative type of data. Sometimes could be quantitative, sometimes can be a qualitative type of data. But of course, that's why you bring experts in the field to verify a certain idea whether something you're proposing is justifiable for funding, whether is meaningful, whether is truthful in the end. And having panel people who are serving on the panel covering all the aspects of scientific research, in my case, relative to metabolic diseases, actually, I think assures the fair, unbiased review. And you have actually, you usually have 3 reviewers that review your proposal. So just make sure that, again, this scientific rigor and accuracy actually are there in the proposal and something that can be funded in the end. So.
Something that I might add, I think that it's useful for maybe a non-scientific audience to think about this is, you know, when I have work done on my house, I have to have somebody from the city come and inspect it before the electrical system is deemed quality or, you know, finished. Science is the same way. If I submit a paper that has some synthetic chemistry experiments in it, an outside synthetic chemist who has no relationship to me looks at it for the same level of accuracy because they're expert in what I've done. And so so it's that level of rigor. It's someone who knows the very details that, you know, that I go into an experiment to, that is able to comment on if my results are reliable.
From a sort of outsider's perspective as a non-scientist, there's been some emphasis on expertise. But another thing that people might look for is a lack of conflict of interest. And so if, for example, a drug company's IRB members have financial ties to the company, there might be concerns about the objectivity of their review.
And IRB is Institutional Review Board. So what, you want to tell us what the IRB does? Just
Ethics review of a proposal for human research. And an IRB will look at things like the adequacy of the informed consent form, the way in which prospective subjects are selected, and whether that's fair or, possibly picking on disadvantaged groups, and whether the risks are being adequately communicated, the benefits not exaggerated, that sort of thing.
And there are financial disclosures that take place for that very reason, to ensure that there's independence and not a tie to the company, to ensure that there is objectivity there.
All right. So next up, so what structures exist to continue the benefit evaluation process as things move towards clinical and commercial application? So Cheryl?
Yeah, so as you're moving through the different phases of development in the clinical trial space, you start getting multidisciplinary teams involved in the evaluation. One is health economics, statisticians, clinicians, as well as the regulatory and ethical bodies that get involved. So there are things such as health technology assessments, which look at the economic evaluation frameworks, and data repositories to look at outcomes of the research. Sponsor companies, as I think the gentleman first mentioned as well, is you're responsible for submitting benefit risk analyses to ensure that the medication that you're actually providing to patients, the benefit outweighs the risks, et cetera, and you have to submit those through regulatory agencies. But for those who don't know much about clinical trials, the clinical operations team is probably one of the most inspected functions in a company, right next to the manufacturing of the actual products. So we have daily extensive interactions with regulatory agencies and questions along the way as we're conducting our research. And they look at our data for serious adverse events and things that might be happening, whether there's explanation for those, whether there are signals in the data that indicates that something's happening from a safety perspective. So there's a lot of interaction across different communities in the sponsor company, but also with the regulatory bodies that govern how we conduct our research.
So the picture that I'm getting is sort of a rigorous review process, trying to judge the research from an objective perspective. So before we sort of launch into the next set of questions, so Cindy, in terms of, so you mentioned that you are an associate editor of a journal. So you want to just, this is unprompted, but just discuss a little bit the review process from the journal perspective.
Sure. So I've been an associate editor for a particular journal for, I think, 5 years now. And our process is submitted manuscripts come in, the associate editor, there are many of us, I happen to be the US one, the associate editor figures out if it's within scope and of suitable quality for the journal, and then we pick reviewers, well, we ask many, many people to be reviewers of the article, and these are folks that don't know the authors, have not collaborated on the work, are not in the same institution as the author. And so there's sort of a conflict of interest checklist that we go down, but are experts in that field. We ask a whole bunch of folks and get some volunteers. It's entirely volunteer-based. And then those reviewers are asked to go through every detail of the manuscript. Then there's typically a couple of rounds of editing, meaning the reviewers ask the authors to either go back and do more experiments or be more clear in their details, et cetera, before the manuscript is eventually perhaps published. Sometimes it's rejected, so that's.
So what's the acceptance rate at your journal?
I should know that. I don't know off the top of my head. I know what the rejection rate. Well, so maybe 30 to 40%.
30 to 40%.
Yeah, quick math. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds similar to many fields. So it's So when you're looking at the reviews, you're really looking for some of the traits that we've discussed here in the review process.
Yeah, it really gets in the nitty gritty of the data and what's missing and what more experiments need to be done to prove the author's point, things like that.
Yeah, there are holes in the argument
Yep.
and whatnot. So with this sort of setup of rigorous review of scientific product and research, there is a perception in the public of a lack of trust in science and the scientific process. So why is that eroded? David?
Well, there's a question about why there's a perception of reduced trust, and I would answer that. I'm not a social scientist, so I'm sort of an amateur here, but I think there's an awareness of increasing political polarization. One of our two major parties has leaders that encourage mistrust of science, I think no matter how rigorous it is. And there's also massive spread of misinformation on the internet where quality control is almost impossible. So that was partly about a perception of mistrust. Has there actually been a decline in trust in the sciences and in scientists in the past 5 or 10 years? I did look a little bit at Pew polls, PEW polls, and it looked like after the beginning of the pandemic, there was a significant drop for a while. And then in 2023, the most recent year for which they had data, there's a little bit of an uptick in trust in scientists, but it's still below pre-pandemic levels. One really striking pattern is that there's a big difference between members of our different parties. And among Democrats, trust in scientists, almost 90% indicate trust in scientists and science. And among Republicans, just about 2/3. So politics seems to have a lot to do with this.
Sounds like politics and social media discussions of topics untethered to the rigorous review process that we've described here. So why is it important to maintain public trust in science? Cheryl, how about you first?
So to actually get individuals to sign an informed consent and participate in clinical research is absolutely paramount to actually developing new drugs and marketing those in the marketplace. So it ensures that you've got participants willing to actually put a foreign substance in their body, be aware of some of the effects that it may have, and be willing to have data collected and participate in that trial through the end, which is no small feat when you look at some of the duration of these clinical trials. We often have issues with patient retention. They might get partway through a trial, discontinue, has all kinds of implications on your statistical analyses, et cetera. So the trust in the science is actually very critical in my field. The other thing that I would mention is having worked on more than 100 medicines that are on the market today in numerous countries, maintaining public trust in science throughout the process, absolutely critical for the success and the integrity of our clinical trials. So public willingness to actually participate in a trial. There are some surveys who have gone out to patients to say, would you be willing to participate in a clinical trial? The actual percentage that are willing to participate are fairly low, unless it is in a therapeutic area, for example, oncology, where that may in fact be your last potential option for treatment for something that has not worked in other therapies. So I think the willingness of diverse individuals to participate in trials is difficult. You do also need to enroll a representative population into the clinical trials, which again, I think that's where some of the distrust in science comes into effect, as well as some ethnic groups are not as willing and as trusting of science as others. So that becomes difficult when you're trying to actually enroll a representative population in the clinical trial. But when that trust is eroded, it can slow down the scientific progress and jeopardize public health. And I think if you look at the medicines that are in development today and the science, it's moving at a very rapid pace in certain therapeutic areas. Oncology is phenomenal. The amount of medications that are being developed and treatments for different types of cancers. And without the willingness of patients to actually enroll on those studies, we can't actually get those drugs to market and actually help the patients that are out there. So for my area, the trust in the science is absolutely critical.
The way I think about it is that the importance of public trust has to do with the public trust in sciences has to do with, or the reason it's so important is that the sciences are our best way of finding out about empirical reality when everyday observation isn't enough. It's a lot better, for example, than astrology, no offense to anybody, or Ouija boards, or intuition, or social media. And so it's a way of finding out more about empirical reality that can benefit our lives. And public health depends on sound, scientifically informed policies on all sorts of matters, such as medicine, of course, including vaccines, and climate, and gun safety, and research investments, and what kind of payback society gets from them. So that's how I see the importance of public trust in science.
I was just going to add, you mentioned vaccines. We can see the effect on how when the public chooses not to believe in science and they choose not to take vaccines, then you see increased disease rates, and you see kids dying of measles when kids haven't died from measles in decades. And so it becomes not just a long-term public health issue with respect to clinical trials, but an immediate public health issue when you think about folks right now who are dying of completely preventable diseases. And one of the things that has struck me over the last several months, a lot of us have been thinking about this, is nobody in this room remembers a time when large numbers of children died of preventable disease. Or infectious disease that is now cured by antibiotics. All of that happened roughly around the 1940s, 1950s. And people used to have 10 kids because only 5 of them would make it. And so I think people now just haven't lived with that reality. And when you start to erode public trust, you stop taking vaccines, you don't believe in antibiotics, we're going to see those numbers rise again. We already have.
So certainly looking at those societal impact. Yeah. All right. So one of the topics that you've mentioned in the past, going back to sort of trust, and is sort of that objective assessment of scientific findings. At the heart of that is conflict of interest policies. So speaking as a former program officer at the National Science Foundation, I spent a lot of time looking at conflicts and ruling reviewers out if they had a conflict. So what concerns about conflicts of interest? That's at what I just mentioned is at the reviewer level, but there are other kinds of conflicts of interest. So what about conflicts of interest and funding sources might impact research findings and thinking about the trust in science as well? Who'd like to weigh in on this one? Yeah. Okay, Alex?
It's a great question. I'm not sure how to respond to this. As you mentioned, there are so many different forms of conflict of interest. This is ways to address is to exclude people from the review if you are connected with professionally or by other means with the people submitting manuscript or submitting proposals. Yeah, I'm not sure what I can add to this topic, honestly. Cynthia, I don't know whether you...
So we all have to fill out forms feels like several times a year
Right.
on our finances. And do you have stock in this company? Do you have a spouse that works for XYZ company that might stand to benefit if you get funded from this? So there are all kinds of questions that are repeatedly asked.
So one of the topics that has come up in past years is, for example, is the support of the tobacco industry into research.
Oh, that's good.
And so, so the concern there is that the company is funding research that's going to sort of lead to the outcome that will benefit them as a corporate entity, which then leads to questions about your financial interests and the financial interest of people in your family, much less the companies who are funding you. So there are steps now that I've seen in research to disclose sort of the funding sources. So any comments on that and maybe the impact that would have on sort of the reliability of scientific findings?
So I think the financial disclosures cut across probably everybody's bit of research. And there are things like the Sunshine Act where they have to disclose, where their funding sources are coming from. I think other components like the independent kind of institutional review boards, which are not represented by the company conducting the research, but by the actual hospitals where you're securing patients from, is another step. I think, at least in the clinical trial space, there is a reporting requirement to actually publish a clinical study report on your research for every protocol that you conduct, whether the results are good or bad. So there's transparency there in providing results to the public. I think there are some other kind of independent pieces that also help, like data safety monitoring boards. So independent individuals who are looking at the safety information being collected and running analyses there. So I think, my industry, sometimes likened to the tobacco industry at times by people, I think folks don't actually see all of what happens around the research to actually protect the participants in the research and to protect and ensure that the actual results are not being biased by the company.
So what can be done we spent some time here talking about trust. So what can be done to address the erosion of trust, to the extent there is erosion of trust, to your point?
Well, maybe we go back to the last question just for a moment. Disclosure is very important and transparency, but I think in general, when funding comes from a company that has a vested interest in the results, there's the possibility of biasing a study maybe in the design or the way data are collected and interpreted and so on. And there's, as far as I know, there's no guarantee that such manipulations won't lead to success, interesting findings, publishable, and so on. And so the reason I mention this is that I think one part of the solution is to restore previous levels of public funding for scientific research at universities, which is probably not an unpopular thing to say at a university. But public funding does, at least to some extent, eliminate that possible problem of conflict of interest. A second point is not to use ideological criteria for interfering with important work. I mean, currently, there's interference with work that studies like health disparities along the lines of race and class. It's considered verboten now to fund studies that look at equity or diversity. That's really unjustified from any kind of ethical or scientific standpoint. And then also, and again, this touches upon politics, but we should only appoint people who have relevant scientific expertise and a commitment to objectivity to head agencies like HHS and FDA, EPA, Department of Energy, national academies, and so on. And I think some of the problems some legitimate reasons to worry about science now have to do with these things not happening, the things I just mentioned. If you want. Maybe that was just for me.
All right. Any other thoughts on that? All right. So our last question of the evening is, are there policy developments that could work to improve science and the trust in science? So are there policy developments beyond the appointment process that you just described?
Well, I'd actually like to give credit where it's due because I think there have been two developments that actually will improve science and gives the public reason to increase their trust in some areas of science. One is that last April, NIH created the Office of Research, Innovation, Validation, and Application, which is an enormous commitment to begin moving away from animal models to non-animal models that involve human tissues. And this is in response, I think, in part to the translation crisis, in which it has been gradually recognized that success in animal studies showing safety and efficacy in a new drug, for example, very low rates of translation from that success at that level to actually being able to use it in humans. So I think this will promote better science. And then just this last month, NIH created the Standardized Organoid Modeling Center. So human organoids are one type of alternative to using animals. They're lab-grown miniature organs, usually derived from stem cells, that mimic the structure and functioning of organs like the heart, lungs, liver, and intestines, and even to some extent the brain. And here again, you're using human tissues, the relevance of which to human biological response is pretty unquestionable, as opposed to, say, extrapolating from mice tissue to human tissues. So I've been really pleasantly surprised about these two developments, which I think could help a lot and may help public trust in at least some areas of science. I'll also mention a few things that could be done. Again, restore public funding for important research at universities to previous levels. Don't allow rejection of important scientific research on ideological grounds. Support early career training in scientists to communicate effectively with the public. Probably help the public trust scientists more. I would suggest requiring secondary schools to have a significant unit of study on how to think critically about information gotten from the internet, just so that people become better able to sort of sort fact from fiction, which might help increase trust where trust is due in science. And then something like requiring greater transparency of methods and findings in publicly funded institutions and science journals than we currently have. That's my long list.
All right. Any additions? Yep, Cindy.
That was a great list. Thank you, David. I think there are two things. One, I don't know what the time frame of these. So the first thing is you have to trust the experts. If I'm sick, I go to a medically trained person. My car is sick, I go to a mechanic, and I never swap those two, right? And I think to some extent, there are folks in the administration that have lost sight of that in terms of who are you nominating to lead agencies, et cetera. And that is hopefully a fixable problem. The second problem, scientists are generally introverts. That might come as a shock. But when we think about a scientist's image or image of science, And you think about social media, and all of us aren't at least most of us, I don't think, aren't going on Instagram and shouting from the rooftops about the great molecule I just made and the IC50 against this enzyme that I'm interested in, blah, 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 right? But you could argue science has an image problem, and that image could be improved by effective communication from somewhere. Does that come from NIH or NSF or the CDC, et cetera? I'm not sure what the answer is, but it seems like some effort should be taken to improve the scientific image at that level. I don't know how to do that, but
Well, that's a fascinating question about communication. And because it strikes me, if there is a lack of trust in science, one way to resolve that is through maybe one of the causes is a failure to communicate, so to speak. So communicating more effectively about what we're doing in the labs and our successes and the processes could be helpful, which is one reason we're doing this.
one of the things I've noticed, people pay attention to science 1 week in October when the Nobel Prizes are awarded, right? That's when it's on CNN. Yeah. The rest of us think about science all the time, but that's the only time it's on CNN, so that could be improved, right? Yeah.
All right. Alex, you look like you are strongly endorsing that idea. Yeah. Okay.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. All right. So questions from you all of this august panel. Yes.
I don't know if I have a question. I was born in 1951, so I still remember being a child and that there had been all of that great health innovation that saved millions of lives. And I feel like most of what you described in response to the first question, it was an exposition on the scientific method that I heard about in high school. And I think we're in big trouble right now. I think you've listed very quietly and politely some of the things need to be done. But, we were told by leadership and many of those 2/3 of surveyed that the pandemic was only a regular flu. It killed over 1 million people. That's already forgotten. You have the rise of the anti-vaxxers. You have advisory panels are fired. You have officials who put out statistics that don't fit the narrative fired. I've worked 40 years around the world. You're going to have large numbers of people die from disease unnecessarily in this country, including as the health system increasingly collapses, and you're going to have millions of people die around the world, and some of those diseases around the world are going to come here. So you've quietly stated some of the things that should be done, but we're nowhere near boosting trust in health science to turn that around.
Any response? Cindy?
You want to know what I'm really worried about? No, thank you for saying all those things. I didn't want to be a total Debbie Downer, but you're absolutely true, or you're absolutely correct. And if we start defunding graduate programs in the United States, then we have lost our pipeline into the pharmaceutical companies, the technology companies, et cetera, that drive those innovations, right?
Yep.
I have a question based on the previous one and some things that Professors Dowd and DeGrazia were alluding to, which is that when you have an adult population that, I won't mince words here, I consider to be heavily propagandized. I remember Professor DeGrazia mentioned something on the long list, bolstering scientific education, critical thinking, fighting misinformation at the secondary school level. But I was wondering from a moral psychology standpoint, how you would consider, not to sound like a Bolshevik, but like re-educating people, like grown adults who are, so far out of being in school themselves. They're not going back to university, they're not going back to graduate school, they have no trust in science, they have no trust in vaccines, even if they themselves receive the full schedule at a young age.
Correct.
I guess I'm just wondering, how you would consider, is there a quick, effective way that we could turn this around? Or do you think, not to sound like a downer, would it take like a mass casualty event that could really, that sounds horrible. You know what yeah.
Yep. So the question, if the people watching online didn't hear, is we can engage in secondary education campaigns, but what about older adults? Who would like that one? Okay, Cheryl's taking a grab for the mic.
So I do think it's a valid question, because even if you do invest in the secondary education, those children are still at home with that population that is distrusting. So I think you're going to get into a bit of a catch-22 of school trying to move the needle, home not being receptive to that perception. I don't know what the answer is, but I think it's a very hard reality that I do think, unfortunately, it is probably going to take some of these diseases returning, et cetera, to actually put a spotlight on where the trust in science has gone. But I do also think that we probably won't see some of the impacts of the funding cuts and the appointments of individuals in certain roles. You won't see the effects of those in the near-term future. I think those are probably years out when you'll actually see the effect of those decisions.
Not to put too fine a point, people are going to die. And a lot of people are going to die. And hopefully at some stage, all of those adults will wake up. They're going to die overseas first because of the cuts to USAID, et cetera. And then they're going to die in the US.
Just to add one further thought about the psychology and the sociology, I think a lot of people form a lot of their beliefs by following the leader, taking their cues from people they trust. And so it matters, to the extent that that's true, it matters a lot who the leaders are, and the ones who have political power and also just media power. And I'm uneasy with your question because it's a really hard problem. And I think there are a number of culprits here, but I think the American political system has a lot of problems in being representative. And so that is not helping at the moment. But it would help if people who are powerful in media and in their political parties are sending helpful messages rather than hurtful ones.
I saw a hand in the back.
I really agree with David about the power of leadership, but I think, science has a PR problem, and they need like a spokesperson, like whatever, TV star or internet, podcast star. And I was just wondering if you ever thought of, is there any leadership in that area where someone could come forward and maybe lead a sort of a rebirth of science?
That's an interesting question. So a charismatic television star who can sort of popularize the scientific movement and findings.
It was like Bill Nye the Science
Yes,
Guy.
like Bill Nye.
Like Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
There was some leadership in astronomy, Neil deGrasse Tyson was popular for a while. I don't know.
That's an interesting thing. I'm looking at Peter Loge, our director of the School of Media and Public Affairs, for suggestions on what we could do on that front. And he laughs. That probably says it.
These are really critical questions, and as you know, Paul, I've worked in these in federal agencies around town. People listen to people they trust, right? And often those are political elites or media elites. And the question is, who listens to whom about what, in what context, and how do we then get them to do the thing we want, right? And in some cases, as pediatricians on climate change, for example, right? So I don't know that I need people to trust health science. What I need people to do is get vaccinated. So how's that going to happen? And that then becomes sort of the influencers, who are the leaders, who are the media, which I think is a bit of a different question. So I don't need to understand my vaccine. I just need to know I need to get it. So I'm less likely to get sick. When I get sick, I'm less likely to die. Got it. I don't care who told me that, as long as I do it.
So maybe there's a bridge to medical education, local providers who are probably more likely to be known and trusted as opposed.
Pediatricians in, one of the trusted advocates on climate change, for example, are local weather forecasters. Because you watch your local news for the weather. There's a bad storm. Storms continue to get worse because climate's changing, so here's what we need to do next. Oh, now I'm learning about the weather. I don't need to understand meteorology. I need to know it's raining a lot. So where are those people?
All right. And other thoughts, David?
So it seems to me that this conversation about trust in science is part and parcel of the larger degradation of trust in just organizations and institutions and, formerly sort of objectively trusted, whether our religious institutions or our universities or our government. And all of that has declined measurably over time. So I'm just from a sociological perspective, I mean, this seems to be a much bigger issue than just our trust in science. I'm just wondering, how do we start to address that? Because it's not fixing trust in science, it's trust in general.
So the question is, we've seen a decrease in trust in institutions more broadly than just science. So how do we go about addressing that?
Elect a president who is a uniter and not a divider. That's one step.
Okay, so presidential elections. We are not taking a political statement for campaigns here, by the way. Yes.
So it seems like there's also a little bit of tension between the scientific process and I guess almost like a reality of people who, quote unquote, do their own research. And by that I mean, in the scientific process, it's worth asking the question, what are the side effects of this drug? What are the side effects of this vaccine? Does this vaccine cause autism? And it is worth doing a study on that and looking at those questions and looking at those results. And whether you have a process in that experiment that is flawed or statistical significance that's perhaps not correctly calculated, once that study is released to the public and that question goes out to the public, like the analogy of someone who gossips, right? They rip the pillow and then they say collect the feathers the next day, and you can't collect the feathers. You can't undo the fact that someone has asked that question and released those results. How do you balance the interest and the necessity of conducting scientific research and asking the questions about what are the side effects of this with the possibility that something could go wrong, or that you could have one study that says one thing and 100 studies that say the other thing. So the medical community will say, okay, we're going to trust these 100 studies and these meta-studies and these double-blind studies, but there's this one study that looked at 3 people anecdotally, and that's now in the public. And when someone does a social media post or they're talking about it, they can speak factually to say that there was a study that looked at this and found that. And I guess, what are your thoughts on balancing balancing sort of the need to ask important questions and do studies with the understanding that this study could end up being twisted and perverted in a way that may be harmful to the rest of the scientific community and to your research later on?
Yeah.
So my knee-jerk response, there are 2 things. First, science is hard and long. Yeah? And people are generally not patient. And so that's where the tension is. And so if you have conflicting studies, then I say trust the experts. The American Academy of Pediatrics is going to look at all the data and they're going to come up with a finding because there are a whole bunch of smart people that know about that. Yeah. But if you have somebody on the internet that's saying, oh, take this snake oil and it'll cure all of your diseases, that's, oh, look, somebody said this and they sounded like they know what they were talking about, so I'm going to go buy this from Amazon. Yeah, that's not science. And so I think the American public wants something that's cheap and easy and fast, but that's not what science is.
Yeah, I think, even once a medicine has made it to market, there's post-marketing surveillance, which gets to that duration, post-marketing to see if there are any kind of signals that come from that data. But I do agree that folks consume the information and you can make general statements that are not actually factual, which is where I think we have an issue where most individuals are lay people, they don't understand the science, et cetera, so they are looking to someone to provide that conclusion for them. And that's where I think it gets dangerous, where you quote one study out of 1,000 sort of thing. And that's where I think the responsibility in the individuals making those claims is to be responsible and not twist it to what outcome they want to kind of push forward. But how you govern that, I think it comes back to the question of there's a societal issue here with social media not having to have scientific evidence behind it. You can say whatever you want and it's fact because you've said it, right? But I think there are ways to monitor and look for those long-term effects, but I'm not sure that the majority of the public would actually even look at the publications or the conclusions of a publications and understand that scientific kind of rigor.
I agree with that, but maybe part of the job of science is patiently communicating such things as, there are a lot of studies. One of them seems to point a certain way. Here are a few reasons to think this study is not giving us the right result. And then again, learning how to communicate with the public who can understand a lot if they're communicated with well. Even though, it's very difficult.
All right, and we have time for one last, so I'm going to go over here to Alex.
So it's kind of been touched on in the room, but I'm perhaps curious, and I know that this has come up a little bit last year during the Dean's Conversation series when we were talking about, in particular, politics and how a lot of those things are communicated in the media. And so one of the questions that I have is you sort of touched on and mentioned this idea of like what these scientific studies say, but kind of to the point that you made too, if I got a hold of one of those things, I don't really know or understand what I'm reading. And so my question back to you all would perhaps be, where, in your thought process, where's the responsibility on you making the information digestible, but also, for lack of a better way to describe, sexy enough so that I read it and I listen to it in a way that makes me understand what it is you need me to understand, kind of to the point of, I don't necessarily need to know how the vaccine works. I just need to know that if you don't do this thing, here are the consequences. So I'm just kind of curious on your thoughts.
I mean, I think that's probably part of the problem is most scientists, right, are publishing their results in well-respected journals, et cetera. It's not with the intent to put into social media or other areas where folks can go and consume their information. And maybe that's something we need to think about, right, moving forward, is how do you take the introverted scientists and think through, how am I going to get this point across to a larger audience than just my publication in X New England Journal of Medicine, et cetera. I just think from at least the folks that publish that I work with, that's not their intent, right? Their intent is to get into that prestigious publication, share their science, share their outcomes, their conclusions, et cetera. It's not necessarily the population, which is maybe where we do have the communication issue amongst science to portray that. I think it does have to come from a voice that doesn't feel pushed to the, so again, I work for pharma and biotech. For us to be putting out that information, folks might look at that and say, well, that's just to your benefit, et cetera. So you have to have the right spokesperson for it as well.
And it strikes me here, it really goes to who your audience is, which I think is what you're saying. So for most academics, regardless of field, you're really targeting an audience of specialists, typically, the reviewers and the people in your field who will judge your contribution. You're not necessarily thinking about the broader public audience most of the time for most academics, and that certainly would be the case in the sciences too. And yet, since we have an issue with institutional trust in higher ed or with science and with other institutions, it really is incumbent on us to work on that. And so as a university, as a college, we do translate some, not all, scientific findings into digestible form in communications that we send out, whether that be for the Columbian College, the CCI Spotlight or GW Today or the research publications that the university does. We are translating those scientific findings for a different audience at that point. And I think that's important for us to do and to continue to do. We can't do that for every scientific finding on campus, but I think that is important for us to continue to work on. So I'm going to wrap it up with that, and Evie is now going to change the slide because I want to do a promo for the next in the series. So this is the first. The next will be Reaching for the Stars, Big Equipment for Big Science. So it'll be on astrophysics. So come back on November 19th for that event. We will continue the conversations out in the hallway. I think we have some goodies for a reception. So thank you all for coming tonight, and look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you. Thank you.